two nations, two political systems, two ideologies. In the epic contest between capitalism and communism, only one would prevail.
An iron curtain has descended across the continent.
The standoff divided Europe and engulfed the world.
I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
Marked by confrontation, might, and maneuvering.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over.
Punctuated by anxiety, paranoia, and fear.
But will still be one communist, two men.
Two civilizations, one epic question. Would the rivals destroy each other or find common ground and survive the Cold War?
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
It was July 1945. Harry S. Truman was bound for Europe at a meeting of the Grand Alliance, the coalition of the three leading Allied powers of World War II. The American president was poised between two of history's greatest battles, the World War that was ending and the Cold War that would replace it. Monumental issues confronted Truman and his wartime partners. The control of defeated Germany, post-war boundaries, winning the war with Japan, securing a lasting peace for Europe.
There's not one piece of territory or one thing of a monetary nature that we want out of this war. We want peace and prosperity for the world as a whole.
Victory over Germany had restored peace to Europe, but it was already threatened by a growing rift between the partners themselves. At the Potsdam Conference, President Truman and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill were on one side of the divide, determined to secure political freedom and democratic governments throughout post-war Europe. Their partner, the dictator of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, had other plans. He was determined to dominate all of Europe and impose communism on its nations. The Allies had won the war, but their alliance would not survive the peace. Historic differences would prove too great to overcome. The bitter rivalry had its roots in the years of the First World War, when the competing ideas of communism and liberal democracy first came into conflict. Beginning in 1914, World War I consumed Europe in killing and destruction. For the Western powers, the war was hell. For the Russian army, it was pure hell, 20 times over. Sent to fight without food, without ammunition, sometimes even without weapons, the demoralized soldiers were a human sacrifice to the war gods, offered up by a corrupt imperialist ruler, Russia's Tsar Nicholas II. At home, the Tsar urged his subjects to work harder, eat less, support the doomed war effort. By 1917, the Russian people were tired of the war, tired of starving, and tired of their Tsar. In February of that year, a public demonstration for a higher bread ration escalated into a popular rebellion. Tsar Nicholas was overthrown and imprisoned. A new government came to power. They promised democratic elections, new freedoms, equal rights for women.
A revolution belongs to the people. I propose to defend it against any attack, whether from the left or from the right.
Russia's flirt with democracy would be short-lived. In Switzerland, an exiled Russian named Vladimir Lenin was planning his own revolution, based on the writings of the German philosopher Karl Marx. Living in 19th century England, Marx witnessed firsthand the growing disparity between the rich and the poor. He predicted that the inequities of the capitalist system would inspire a spontaneous revolution of the modern working class, the proletariat. Capitalism would be replaced by a system of social and economic equality called communism.
We declare openly that our ends can only be achieved by the forcible overthrow of all social conditions.
Lenin interpreted Marx's beliefs with religious and violent fervor. He returned to Russia to lead a group called the Bolsheviks and condemned the new government.
They imagine that serious political questions are decided by voting. As a matter of fact, they are decided by class war.
In October 1917, Lenin launched his revolution and seized control of Russia. He and his band of comrades then set about establishing their workers' paradise, the modern Soviet socialist state. Bank accounts and personal property were confiscated. Private fields became collectivized farms. Stores and businesses were surrendered to the state. Lenin was intolerant of dissent and totally ruthless. Arrest without charge, imprisonment without trial, disappearance without explanation. All became routine. In the United States, President Woodrow Wilson followed events in Russia with growing unease. He had committed his nation to World War I in order that the world be made safe for democracy. In his 14 points address to Congress, he outlined how to achieve his lofty goals based on principles of national self-determination, free trade, and international cooperation. But the president's vision for the future did not include the Bolsheviks. Instead, when civil war broke out in Russia in 1919, Wilson sent troops to fight against Lenin's government. And in England, a young Winston Churchill urged swift action. Before the House of Commons, he declared, "We must strangle the infant Bolshevism in the cradle." Such rhetoric convinced Lenin and his comrades, including Joseph Stalin, that the West would stop at nothing to destroy their communist dream. Nearly 3 decades later, the battling ideologies remained bitterly opposed, and Potsdam did nothing to bridge the divide. President Truman called on Stalin to withdraw his troops from Eastern and Central Europe and to hold the free elections he had promised. Stalin refused. The region was a buffer zone, he said, and essential to his nation's security. The president was unconvinced. In his diary, he condemned the Soviet dictator for running a
police government, plain and simple. A few top hands just take clubs, pistols, and concentration camps and rule the people on the lower level.
But Truman had a trump card. His nation had developed an entirely new class of weapon. It was destined to win the war with Japan, but it would also provide leverage in dealing with people like Stalin. If it worked, Truman noted, I'll certainly have a hammer on those boys. On the first day of the Potsdam Conference, a blinding flash seared the New Mexico desert, ushering in the atomic age. The Manhattan Project had produced the world's first nuclear explosion. For the father of the bomb, Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the awesome sight summoned the words of the Hindu god Vishnu. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. The president gave his final go-ahead to drop the bomb on Japan. "Release when ready," he wrote. When Stalin learned that the city of Hiroshima had been destroyed by the American bomb, it came as no surprise. His spies within the Manhattan Project had long ago revealed its existence. But Truman's willingness to use the weapon presented a stark new reality for the Soviet leader. In a war fought with atomic bombs, his mighty Red Army would be rendered impotent. "The balance has been destroyed," he would later tell the scientists working on the Russian bomb. "That cannot be." Potsdam was the first and final meeting between Stalin and Truman, and set the tone for the early Cold War. In the words of one British diplomat, it was a very bad-tempered conference. As President Truman sailed for home, he could scarcely have imagined the decades of Cold War that lay ahead. There would be no Pearl Harbor in this coming struggle, no sudden attacks or declarations of war, just a growing sense of fear and distrust, pulling the former Allies toward a confrontation that neither could afford, but that neither would manage to escape.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin.
In 1946, Winston Churchill raised the alarm, warning that tyranny was once again on the march in Europe.
And all these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere. And all are subject, in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow.
Churchill's words drew criticism on both sides of the Atlantic. Neither the British nor the American people were ready for another war. But in the months since Potsdam, the Soviet Union was behaving more like an enemy than an ally. Joseph Stalin's Red Army had projected his authority throughout Eastern Europe. Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the eastern zone of Germany had come under the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. This was Stalin's buffer zone, assurance against future invasions. Initially, Stalin handpicked candidates to join coalition governments in these countries, but slowly all opposing factions were eliminated until only the hardline communists remained. Many Eastern Europeans fled to escape the coming storm. Millions of others were forcibly deported. Scenes of mass expulsions were seared into the mind of one American intelligence officer. 27 boxcars packed and heading east to the Soviet work camps. Stalin continued to test the limits of the World War II Grand Alliance. He warned his people that war with the West was inevitable. Washington was at a loss to explain the hostility. What did the Soviet leader want? Were his ambitions limitless? The best answer came from George F. Kennan, who had spent years observing the Kremlin as an American diplomat stationed in Moscow. In an 8,000-word dispatch to Washington, now known as the Long Telegram, Kennan deciphered the Soviet riddle. At the bottom of the Kremlin's neurotic view of world affairs is the traditional and instinctive Russian sense of insecurity, he said. Stalin needed to present the outside world as hostile and menacing in order to justify his own bloody regime. This didn't mean that the Soviets desired war with the West, Kennan emphasized. Soviet leaders may be impervious to the logic of reason, but they would be highly sensitive to logic of force and would back down if confronted with strong resistance. A year later, writing under the pseudonym X, Kennan proposed a long-term, patient but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. Kennan's idea of containment formed the basis of American Cold War policy for the next 50 years. Before long, it was put to the test. In 1947, the British announced that they could no longer afford to support the pro-Western governments of the Mediterranean in their fight against communism. If the U.S. could not take up the burden, the whole region was in danger of falling under communist rule. The Truman administration responded decisively. On March 12, 1947, the president went before a joint session of Congress to request aid for the countries of Greece and Turkey. The address sent a clear message to the Soviet Union.
I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedom. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation.
The president's appeal was quickly dubbed the Truman Doctrine. It represented a dramatic change in U.S. foreign policy, but it merely laid the groundwork for what followed. A month later, Secretary of State George C. Marshall traveled to Europe. He witnessed firsthand the physical ruin, social disintegration, and economic collapse left by the war. Marshall warned that under these conditions, Europeans would turn to communism as an alternative to starvation and death. 2 months later, Marshall proposed a program of massive economic assistance, the Marshall Plan.
Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Its purpose should be the revival of a working economy in the world so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist.
European reaction to Marshall's speech was quick and positive. The British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin hailed it as a lifeline to sinking men. Of all the nations invited to help draft the plan, only the Soviet Union and its satellites refused. The price would be high, up to $17 billion. But compared to the alternative, Marshall told Congress it was a bargain.
This program should be viewed as an investment in peace. In those terms, the cost is low.
While Congress debated the enormous financial commitment, communist-inspired riots led to the overthrow of the democratically elected government in Czechoslovakia. The events galvanized opinion on Capitol Hill, and Congress approved funding for the Marshall Plan. American aid was soon on its way to Europe. Food was distributed, machinery and technical support spurred new production. Homes and businesses were rebuilt. Marshall Plan aid provided nets for Flemish fishermen, money to rebuild Italian automotive factories, construction equipment for France, and coal to fuel Danish industry. The Marshall Plan was an overwhelming success. It launched Western Europe on the road to recovery, beat back the threat of communism in the region, and established the United States as the world's dominant economic superpower. It also contributed to the first major confrontation of the Cold War. At the Potsdam Conference in 1945, the Allies had agreed to temporarily divide Germany into 4 occupation zones, administered by the U.S., Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and France. The German capital of Berlin, which lay deep within the Soviet zone, was partitioned in the same way. But 3 years later, Germany remained divided, and Berlin had become a microcosm of the Cold War struggle for all of Europe. The Soviet foreign minister emphasized the importance of the German capital. What happens to Berlin happens to Germany. What happens to Germany happens to Europe. The Soviets had plundered the eastern zone of Germany, hauling off machinery, equipment, train tracks, even entire factories to rebuild the Soviet Union. At the same time, the zones under Western control were beginning to thrive. To aid in the recovery, a new currency was introduced, the Deutschmark. Stalin condemned the move as American economic imperialism and retaliated. On June 24, 1948, he ordered all land access into the city of West Berlin to be sealed off, beginning the Berlin blockade. Roads and railways were shut down. Shipments of goods languished at border crossings. Power to the city was turned off. Stalin was determined to force the Western Allies out of West Berlin and starve its people into submission. The German capital symbolized American commitment to Europe, but was saving West Berlin worth the risk of war with the Soviets? There would be no debate. President Truman declared, "We are going to stay, period." Within days, the United States and Great Britain orchestrated the Berlin airlift to resupply the beleaguered city. Day and night, planes ferried in food, coal, and medical supplies. On average, a flight landed in West Berlin every 3 minutes. More than 2 million tons of cargo were delivered to Berlin during the 15-month operation. Each mission brought the threat of Soviet military intervention, but it never came, and the flights continued unchallenged. Finally, in May 1949, the Soviets relented and lifted the blockade. In its wake, any hopes to reunify the country were abandoned, and a permanently divided Germany became a reality. Democratic West Germany and Communist East Germany. The blockade underscored the need for a united defense against Soviet aggression. In 1949, the United States and Canada joined with 10 European nations to form a military alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. A rebuilt, rearmed West Germany would join the alliance in 1955. In response, the Soviet Union and its satellites formed a competing alliance, the Warsaw Pact. Through 1948, the success of the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and the Berlin airlift had frustrated Soviet plans to dominate Europe. But the Red Star was rising, and 1949 would be an explosive year for world communism. In August, the Soviets stunned the world when they successfully tested their own atomic bomb, years ahead of expert predictions. And in China, communist revolutionary Mao Zedong prevailed in a decades-long civil war against the Chinese nationalist government. Nearly 500 million Chinese fell under communist rule. For decades to come, Mao would be the linchpin of revolution in Asia, supporting fledgling governments in Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Malaya, and in Korea, where the Cold War superpowers drew perilously close to World War III. Through the early years of the Cold War, the Truman administration's policy of containment had halted Soviet expansion in Europe. Their attempts to halt the spread of communism elsewhere were much less successful. The end of World War II brought renewed violence in a long-running Chinese Civil War. In 1949, Communist leader Mao Zedong launched an all-out offensive to defeat Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government. American efforts to mediate an end to the conflict failed, and Chiang's government was forced to flee into exile. At home, conservatives blamed President Truman's administration for what they called the loss of China to communism. News that the Soviets had successfully tested their first atomic bomb and a series of sensational spy cases convinced many that the enemy had seized the initiative in the Cold War. In June 1950, these fears seemed to be confirmed when the Communist Army of North Korea launched a blistering attack against its neighbor, South Korea. Within days, they had overrun the capital of Seoul and forced the defending South Korean army into full retreat. The North Korean invasion was the first military challenge of the Cold War. How the United States responded to the threat was critically important. Following World War II, Korea was temporarily divided at the 38th parallel and jointly occupied by the United States in the south and the Soviet Union in the north. The Soviets turned North Korea into a communist state. They installed into power a dictator named Kim Il-sung. In South Korea, the United States established a pro-Western government under Syngman Rhee, an oppressive yet fanatically anti-communist leader. Both Rhee and Kim aspired to unite Korea under their own rule, but neither the U.S. nor the Soviet Union would allow their client states to start a war. That changed in 1950. Kim finally convinced Joseph Stalin to support his invasion of South Korea. Kim would provide the troops, Stalin would supply the military hardware, and Mao Zedong, if it became necessary, would provide Chinese reinforcements. Kim promised that victory would be swift and decisive. But it would be neither. Half a world away, the North Korean invasion sparked intense debate in Washington. Was the assault ordered by the Soviets? Was this the beginning of World War III? President Truman and his advisors quickly decided to take action.
An act of aggression such as this creates a very real danger to the security of all free nations. This challenge has been presented squarely. We must meet it squarely.
The U.S. acted through the United Nations. Their mandate was explicit: repel the attack and restore peace to the area. A coalition of 15 countries agreed to send troops. But the overwhelming majority of fighting men were American, fighting under General Douglas MacArthur to defend American interests in the region. In diplomatic language, it was termed a police action, but it was a war. In the words of military historian Slam Marshall, the century's nastiest little war. General MacArthur rushed his troops to the battlefront. But the ill-prepared units were completely overwhelmed by the disciplined North Korean army, fighting with Soviet tanks and artillery. Within a month, MacArthur's army had retreated to the tip of the Korean peninsula, near Busan, while plans were laid for a daring amphibious landing behind enemy lines at the port of Incheon. If it were successful, the North Korean army could be trapped. If it failed, UN forces might be wiped out entirely. The assault at Incheon came on September 15, 1950. It was a gauntlet. Dangerous currents, extraordinary tides, defense fortifications, and massive seawalls. One planner described the obstacles. We drew up a list of every natural and geographic handicap, and Incheon had all of them. Despite the challenges, the invasion was a stunning success. Within days, the capital city of Seoul was liberated. With the restoration of South Korea, the UN mission had been accomplished. But General MacArthur demanded the authority to cross the 38th parallel into North Korea. The political risks were immense. Would the Soviets retaliate? Would Communist China intervene? There were rumors that Mao's troops were already massing along the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. President Truman reluctantly agreed to MacArthur's appeal, but he warned his general, stay away from the Chinese border. Mr. President, MacArthur replied, if the Chinese cross the Yalu, I will make of them the greatest slaughter in the history of warfare. In early October 1950, the first American troops marched north, across the 38th parallel, toward China. By the end of October, MacArthur's forces had captured the North Korean capital of Pyongyang. By Thanksgiving Day, they approached the Yalu River. As the general prepared for the final offensive, he cabled President Truman. This should, for all practical purposes, end the war. But MacArthur had underestimated the enemy. On the night of November 25th, the Chinese army struck with fury.
At the White House in Washington, top defense officials of the nation gathered to discuss the gravest world crisis since Poland and Pearl Harbor. The flagrant aggression of Chinese communist troops in Korea arouses the country's ire. With the North Korean bandits well under control and with the promise that UN troops would be withdrawn, the unexpected entry of 300,000 Red Chinese across the Manchurian border may well precipitate World War III. President Truman voices his accusation of Red imperialism.
The forces of the United Nations are in Korea to put down an aggression that threatens not only the whole fabric of the United Nations, but all human hopes of peace and justice. If the United Nations yields to the forces of aggression, no nation will be safe or secure. If aggression is successful in Korea, we can expect it to spread throughout Asia and Europe and to this hemisphere. We are fighting in Korea for our own national security and survival. We have committed ourselves to the cause of a just and peaceful world order through the United Nations. We stand by that commitment.
On the battlefront in Korea, United Nations forces fight desperately to meet the Red attack. Here our troops must face what General MacArthur has termed a new war. Outnumbered more than 2-to-1 by Chinese and North Koreans, the UN forces hope to regroup and to meet the overwhelming attack which has broken their fluid lines of defense across northern Korea.
UN forces fought desperately to escape the Chinese onslaught. At the Chosin Reservoir, 6,000 Marines were encircled by the enemy. With temperatures dipping to minus 40 degrees below zero, their situation seemed hopeless. But in a heroic effort, dubbed the Chosin Breakout, their big guns and air support smashed the Chinese lines. 60,000 enemy troops were killed, and the Marines escaped. General MacArthur demanded that he be allowed to wage an all-out war against China. But President Truman was determined that Korea should remain a limited war. When MacArthur made it clear that he disagreed with that policy, the president fired him. By the spring of 1951, the war had degenerated into a brutal stalemate near the 38th parallel. American troops continued to fight and die in Korea for 2 long years. In the end, more than 4 million soldiers and civilians were killed during the conflict. Among them, 40,000 Americans died. For Harry Truman, the costly war in Korea was a crushing blow to his presidency. His popularity, already weakened by charges of losing China, collapsed. When the ceasefire agreement was finally signed in July 1953, it was Truman's successor, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who earned the credit.
We have won an armistice on a single battleground, not peace in the world. We and our United Nation allies must be vigilant against the possibility of untoward developments.
Korea is often called the Forgotten War, but it dramatically changed America's sense of security. For many, it reinforced the belief in monolithic communism, the assumption that all communist movements were orchestrated from Moscow. The idea poisoned American politics for decades and set the stage for the disaster in Vietnam. Korea also put the country on a permanent war footing, leading to spiraling defense spending and greatly increasing the Pentagon's influence. By the end of his term in 1960, President Eisenhower warned of a growing threat to the nation from within.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
Attention, attention. This is an official civil defense warning. This is not a test. The United States is under nuclear attack. Take cover immediately in your area fallout shelter. Repeat, the United States is under nuclear attack.
America's Cold War years were filled with fear. Daily radio and newspaper reports blared frightening stories of advancing communism, imminent nuclear war, and Soviet spies. America responded with an all-out offensive against communist infiltration.
The growing menace of communism arouses the House of Representatives Un-American Activities Committee. Among the well-informed witnesses testifying is J. Edgar Hoover, head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Mr. Hoover speaks with authority on the subject.
Communism in reality is not a political party. It is a way of life, an evil and malignant way of life. It reveals a condition akin to disease that spreads like an epidemic. And like an epidemic, a quarantine is necessary to keep it from infecting this nation.
While Hoover's FBI worked behind the scenes, Congress expanded its own high-profile investigations, often ignoring the civil rights of the accused.
Are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I believe I have the right to be confronted with any evidence which supports this question. I should like to see what you have.
Oh, well, you would.
Yes.
Beginning in 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, investigated communist influence in Hollywood. The committee was concerned with the power of movies to persuade audiences with subversive messages. With movie stars and other industry professionals called to testify, the hearings became red carpet events. For the anti-communist witch hunt, it was a publicity bonanza.
It is completely against the un-American feeling, this communistic thing. I believe I would move to the state of Texas if it ever came here, because I think the Texans would kill them on sight.
We have sold them some films. A good many years ago, they bought the Three Little Pigs and used it through Russia.
If I had my way about it, they'd all be sent back to Russia or some other unpleasant place.
Most witnesses cooperated with the committee. However, a small group who became known as the Hollywood 10 refused to answer questions, citing protection under the First Amendment. Among them, screenwriter John Howard Lawson.
The question is, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I am framing my answer in the only way in which any American citizen can frame his
then
answer
you denied,
to a question
then
which
you
invades his, absolutely invades
then
his
you
right.
denied, you refused to answer that question. Is that correct?
I have told you that I will offer my beliefs, my affiliations, and everything else to the American public, and they will know where I stand, as they do from what I have written.
Stand away from the stand.
For Americanism for many years, and I shall
stand away from the stand.
For the Bill of Rights, which
stand away from the stand. Therefore, it is the unanimous opinion of this subcommittee, John Howard Lawson is in contempt of Congress.
The Hollywood 10 were convicted of contempt and sent to prison. Thousands of others were blacklisted by the studios, forcing many talented movie makers into exile and obscurity. Among the friendly witnesses who testified in 1947 was a B-movie actor named Ronald Reagan. No one could have suspected that 4 decades later, Reagan would play a leading role in bringing the Cold War to an end.
If communists have attempted to inject their propaganda into the motion picture, they have failed miserably.
Perhaps Hollywood wasn't influenced by communists, but it was affected by the hearings. Movie studios added to the hysteria by cranking out such anti-communist films as Is This Tomorrow?, Red Planet Mars, and dozens of others. But tawdry films did little to distract President Truman from what he saw as a perversion of American democracy.
Now I'm going to tell you how we're not going to fight communism. We're not going to transform our fine FBI into a Gestapo secret police. We're not going to try to control what our people read and say and think. We're not going to turn the United States into a right-wing totalitarian country in order to deal with a left-wing totalitarian threat. In short, we're not going to end democracy. We're going to keep the Bill of Rights on the books.
Against the president's objections, Congress passed more dubious legislation, including the Internal Security Bill of 1950, which empowered the government to take action against anyone it deemed a security risk. Truman called it the greatest danger to freedom of speech, press, and assembly since the Alien and Sedition laws of 1798. In 1948, the Red Hunt struck at the very center of government when ex-communist Whittaker Chambers accused a former State Department employee named Alger Hiss of spying for the Soviet Union.
I first knew him as Crosley. What his name is today, I am not prepared to testify to, or what other names he may have had.
Mr. Hiss represents the concealed enemy against which we are all fighting, and I am fighting.
The House committee was prepared to dismiss the case for lack of conclusive evidence, but one of its members pressed the issue, an ambitious young congressman from California, Richard Nixon.
These documents were fed out of the State Department over 10 years ago by communists who were employees of that department and who were interested in seeing that these documents were sent to the Soviet Union, where the interests of the Soviet Union happened to be in conflict with those of the United States.
Alger Hiss was convicted, not of treason, but of perjury, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. His supporters said he was a victim of the communist hysteria. Others saw him as part of a communist conspiracy to destroy the United States and press the search for more traitors. Within months, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were arrested in connection with a plot to pass U.S. bomb secrets to the Soviets. The Rosenbergs denied the charges and claimed they were being persecuted as Jews and for their left-wing views. The evidence suggested they played a small but material role in the spy ring. The Rosenbergs were convicted and sentenced to die in the electric chair. Protests erupted amid claims of anti-Semitism. The Nobel Prize-winning writer Jean-Paul Sartre condemned the sentence as a legal lynching which smears with blood a whole nation. He warned,
"Your country is sick with fear. You are afraid of the shadow of your own bomb."
Despite the outcry, the Rosenbergs were executed in 1953.
Union Square in New York was the backdrop for these scenes of red violence. From their ranks will come the saboteurs, spies, and subversives, should World War III be forced upon America.
At the height of the anti-communist hysteria, the real danger to America came not from the Reds, but from the so-called Red Baiters.
Even if there were only one communist in the State Department, even if there were only one communist in the State Department, that would still be one communist too many.
Of all the demagogues who exploited the Red Scare for political gain, no one matched the senator from Wisconsin, whose namesake, McCarthyism, would come to define the entire era of political persecution. Senator Joseph McCarthy emerged from virtual obscurity in 1950 when he claimed he had a list of 205 communists working in the State Department. The claim was patently untrue, but it launched McCarthy on a political juggernaut. For 4 years, the senator ran roughshod over civil liberties, while the news media served as a conduit for his reckless, unsubstantiated charges.
He had been a member of the party that he had recommended.
McCarthy's audacity knew no bounds. He accused Secretary of State George Marshall, the architect of the Marshall Plan, of infamy so black as to dwarf any previous venture in the history of man. He threatened President Truman and suggested the Democratic Party was a bedfellow of international communism. The hysteria of McCarthyism seeped into every aspect of American life. People rushed to condemn friends, neighbors, and co-workers. Many were fired or shunned for perceived left leanings. Though McCarthy wore a cloak of patriotism, his abusive actions had a chilling effect on democracy. He was told,
"You have created an atmosphere so vile that people have lost confidence in their government."
But slowly, the tide began to turn. Dissenters spoke out.
McCarthy to wear a new case of known red in Army.
The respected journalist Edward R. Murrow attacked McCarthy's repugnant tactics on his investigative TV series, See It Now.
1 month ago tonight, we presented a report on Senator Joseph R. McCarthy. We labeled it as controversial.
McCarthy remained characteristically defiant.
If I am giving comfort to our enemies, I ought not to be in the Senate. If, on the other hand, Mr. Murrow is giving comfort to our enemies, he ought not to be brought into the homes of millions of Americans by the Columbia Broadcasting System.
With his support withering, McCarthy pitted himself against the U.S. Army in an investigation of charges and countercharges concerning clout, favoritism, and communist cover-ups.
Unless we make sure that there is no infiltration of our government, then just as certain as you sit there, you will see a red world.
The ensuing Army McCarthy hearings tore away the senator's mask of self-righteousness and struck a fatal blow to his crusade.
Until this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness.
The hearings were a media circus, and in the end, inconclusive. But for the tens of millions of viewers who tuned in to watch, McCarthy was revealed to be an arrogant, blustering tyrant.
The American people have had a look at you for 6 weeks. You're not fooling anyone either.
The American public had seen enough. Nearly overnight, McCarthy's immense national popularity evaporated. President Eisenhower probably spoke for millions of Americans when he said,
"It's no longer McCarthyism, it's McCarthyism."
3 years later, Joseph McCarthy died, probably of complications from alcoholism. He was 48 years old. McCarthy faded, but an unsettling question remained. Could America win the Cold War without sacrificing the very liberties it was fighting to safeguard? Ominously, a highly classified government report concluded, "It is now clear we are facing an implacable enemy whose avowed objective is world domination. There are no rules in such a game. Hitherto acceptable norms of human conduct do not apply." A new and frightening day was dawning, one in which legal and moral restraints were set aside in a high-stakes game of diplomatic maneuvering, clandestine operations, and nuclear brinksmanship. Harry Truman and Joseph Stalin led their nations from World War victory in 1945 through 7 years of tense confrontation. By 1953, it was time for a new generation of Cold Warriors to take command. In Washington, the changing of the guard came democratically.
The people speak, and their verdict, a landslide victory for Dwight D. Eisenhower, elected president with the greatest popular vote ever given a White House candidate.
The hero of D-Day, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, became the first Republican president in 20 years. On the campaign trail, Eisenhower pledged to take a hard line with the Soviet Union and to bring an end to the war in Korea.
You have summoned me on behalf of millions of your fellow Americans to lead a great crusade for freedom in America and freedom in the world.
As president, Eisenhower continued the policy of containment, but his administration's new look defense strategy relied more heavily on air power and nuclear weapons. Deploying an effective nuclear arsenal was easier and cheaper than maintaining a massive land army. Eisenhower could defend the nation, cut taxes, and curb inflation, all at the same time. In the expression of the day, it was a bigger bang for the buck. The new look was not just economical, it was aggressive. The White House adopted a policy of massive retaliation to deter Soviet aggression. It stated that if the Soviet Union invaded Western Europe, the U.S. would respond by launching more than 3,000 nuclear missiles against every major urban, industrial, and military target throughout the communist world. Experts estimated that such an attack would kill 285 million people. President Eisenhower refused to consider options that stopped short of total war. But even as the Eisenhower White House was refining its Cold War strategy, news from Moscow that Joseph Stalin had died dramatically altered the playing field. The official cause was a stroke, but many suspected poison. Without a plan for succession, a collective leadership assumed control of the Soviet Union. Almost immediately, they extended an olive branch to the west. Speaking for the party, Georgy Malenkov declared, "We stand as we have always stood for peaceful coexistence of the two systems." Coming from the avowed enemy of capitalism, peaceful coexistence was a radical notion. Was this just Soviet propaganda, or was the new Kremlin really different than the old? In an address dubbed Chance for Peace, Eisenhower called on the Soviets to demonstrate they had truly broken with Stalin's legacy.
I know of only one question upon which progress waits. It is this: what is the Soviet Union ready to do? Whatever the answer is, let it be plainly spoken. Again we say the hunger for peace is too great, the hour in history too late for any government to mock men's hopes with mere words and promises and gestures.
Before the Soviets could respond, the president's seemingly genuine offer was contradicted by his own Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. He ridiculed the idea of peaceful coexistence as a ploy to divide the Western Allies, adding, "We are not dancing to any Russian tune." The chance for peace, if it ever existed, was squandered, and U.S.-Soviet relations continued to vacillate between measured tolerance and outright disdain. 2 years later, in 1955, both nations were seeking opportunities to relax Cold War tensions. They met face-to-face in Geneva, Switzerland, for the first time since the end of World War II.
Some 11 years ago, I came to Europe with an army, a navy, an air force, with a single purpose, to destroy Nazism. This time, I come armed with something far more powerful, the goodwill of America, the great hopes of America, the aspirations of America for peace.
Americans got their first good look at the new Kremlin powers at the summit. There was Soviet Premier Nikolai Bulganin, Defense Minister Marshal Zhukov, and the outspoken head of the Soviet Communist Party, Nikita Khrushchev. During discussions, Eisenhower suggested a program he called Open Skies that would permit air reconnaissance over both countries. Bulganin and Zhukov were receptive to the idea, but Khrushchev quickly denounced the idea as a bold espionage plot. After 2 years of uncertainty, it was clear that Nikita Khrushchev was now the top man in Moscow. Khrushchev's reason for refusing Open Skies was simple. His nation had been threatening the West with nuclear rockets it simply did not have, and bombs it could not deliver onto American soil. These military shortcomings were a closely held secret in the Kremlin, but they would not remain secret for long. On July 4th, 1957, a Lockheed U-2 spy plane made its inaugural flight over the Soviet Union. From an altitude of 70,000 feet, the U-2 captured stunningly clear images of its target. For 4 years, U-2 flights gathered revealing intelligence about Soviet military installations and missile deployments. But President Eisenhower feared the inevitable. Sooner or later, he said, one of these things is going to get shot down. Nikita Khrushchev was an entirely new kind of Soviet leader. He was not evil like Joseph Stalin, but in his relations with the West, he was openly defiant and often belligerent. He boasted of the Soviet Union's vastly superior nuclear capabilities that could wipe out any American or European city. True or not, Khrushchev's threats to unleash his rocket weapons on Western targets was unnerving. But for all his nuclear posturing, Khrushchev could be amiable and at times even likable. In 1959, he engaged Vice President Richard Nixon in an impromptu debate over the relative merits of capitalism and communism.
Teach us some things, and it will teach you some things too. Because after all, you don't know everything.
That every word that you have said here will be reported in the United States, and they will see you say it on television.
Khrushchev would soon have a chance to witness a capitalist democracy firsthand.
The President of the United States has invited Mr. Nikita Khrushchev, Chairman of the Council of Ministers of the USSR, to pay an official visit to the United States in September.
Khrushchev was the first Soviet head of state ever to visit the United States. During his stay, he was exposed to the extremes of American life and culture, from movie stars in Hollywood to farm production in the American heartland.
Nikita Khrushchev's American tour swings into the world's best corn country. And one of the world's most modern, efficient, and profitable farming operations, Khrushchev shows an enthusiasm springing from his Ukrainian peasant background and the interest of a leader whose nation has long known major food production problems.
The Soviet leader acknowledged the riches of the United States, but boasted, "Tomorrow we shall be as rich as you are." The next day, even richer. Meetings with President Eisenhower failed to break new ground, but the two leaders bridged a divide. They pledged to meet again in Paris the following year. Khrushchev was deeply moved by his American experience.
Хорошим американским словом. Окей? Хорошо. До свидания, друзья. I hope that in the relationships between our two countries, we will be able to use more and more often the good short American word, okay, until we meet again, friends.
Upon returning to Moscow, he openly declared, "Long live Soviet-American friendship," pledging his nation to massive cuts in its conventional military as a first step towards peace. By this time, the U-2 had revealed that the Soviets were greatly exaggerating their nuclear capabilities. Seeing continued surveillance as a diplomatic risk, Eisenhower had suspended the flights. But under pressure from his advisors, he reluctantly agreed to allow one more mission.
May Day in Moscow. This year's parade through Red Square is a 3.5-hour affair with emphasis on peaceful coexistence.
On May 1st, 1960, as Kremlin leaders waved to the May Day crowds in Red Square, a U-2, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, was shot down over Soviet airspace. In an instant, the plane, the pilot, and any chance for peaceful coexistence came crashing to Earth. The White House had devised a cover plan for just such an occurrence. They claimed the U-2 was on a weather mission originating in Turkey for NASA and had strayed off course. The next day, they changed the story. The plane was piloted by a civilian, and a failure in oxygen equipment had resulted in the pilot losing consciousness and accidentally violating Soviet airspace. It was all rubbish. Khrushchev knew the U.S. had been flying spy missions over the Soviet Union, and now he had the evidence to prove it. The wreckage of the U-2 and the American pilot, alive and kicking. Trapped, Eisenhower finally came clean with the American public.
Now, this does not put the United States on trial whatsoever.
At the Paris summit 2 weeks later, Khrushchev turned the U-2 incident into a crisis.
Khrushchev outdoes his earlier outburst against President Eisenhower at the commencement of the Paris meeting. Flanked by Foreign Minister Gromyko and glowering Marshal Malinowski, he fires a barrage of threats, insults, and menaces, warns of devastating blows at bases used by American espionage planes, denounces American acts of aggression, and in general follows a tough line that seems to signal a new freezing spell in the Cold War.
The captured U-2 pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was convicted of espionage against the Soviet Union and sentenced to 10 years in prison. It was August 17, 1960. That very same day, in the skies over the Pacific Ocean, an Air Force pilot snatched a falling capsule from midair. The event marked a breakthrough in the top-secret project to develop Corona, the world's first Earth-orbiting reconnaissance satellite. The U-2 may have been downed, but America had a new eye in the sky, and this one could capture stunningly clear and revealing images of its target from more than 100 miles in outer space.